Please could we be given warning at the beginning of a programme if there's going to be anything about the Beatles, as all Beatle fans can make sure to listen, and have a chance to ring up other fans to make sure they are also listening.
Hi everybody, this is John here. This is Paul, George
and Ringo.
And we're very happy to be on your programme once again.
Hi everybody, this is Steve Marinucci and welcome to another episode of Beatles News Briefs. Today is program 110 and we have with our guest the great Piers Hemmingsen, whose encyclopedic knowledge of the Beatles' history in Canada is just absolutely astounding. He's going to be talking about the second book in his two-volume set on the Beatles in Canada, the Blue Book. We're doing something a little different with this podcast. We're doing it in both video and audio. You'll find the video only on YouTube. The audio will be in all the usual places. Hang around after the interview. We have something that Piers gave us to use. It's a clip of the 65 Toronto soundboard in the best quality. It's a non-musical segment, but I'll give you an idea if we ever get the 65 Beatles Toronto soundboard, what you'll hear. If you look in the notes for the show, I also have the link for the Canadian Broadcasting Company's program on how the Beatles changed the world. We talk about that in the show. I found the link and I put it in the notes to the show so you can link on it and listen to it. So let's get started. Hello, everyone. This is Steve Marinucci again, and I'm really glad to be talking with Piers Hemmingsen, the expert on the Beatles in Canada. Piers, it's good to see you again.
Thanks, Steve, and likewise. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, too. We're going to be talking about the new edition of the Beatles in Canada, the Blue Book, and this is just now coming out, correct?
It was published on December the 1st, 2025. Okay. I really pushed hard to get the books printed. It's been a mad dash, and I'm just so thankful, we've been able to get some books out before the end of the year.
Let's talk about the history of the two books. When did the whole project start?
Well, I go back to the late 1990s. I'd come back to Canada from living in England, and I started working on what was then like a mini Bruce Spicer discography series for the Canadian Beatles recordings, vinyl, 7-inch, LP, cassettes, 8-track, and reel-to-reel. And I think those lasted me until about the early, maybe 2005. And then after that, I took a little break, and then I decided I would target a more historical volume. And it was focused originally on how the Beatles came to Canada before they came to the States, if you will, via vinyl records and their recordings. So that book was called The Origins of Beatlemania. By the time I started that project, I was well on my way with a friendship and a mentorship from Paul White, who had been the A&R man for Capitol Records in Toronto, who signed the Beatles to Capitol of Canada in early 1963. So the late 90s, I did a book project with EMI, Capitol Records of Canada. It was their 50th anniversary. Mm-hmm. So I was asked to do the discography for that book. I didn't write the book. I just did this discography for the book in the back. And through that, I think I did a pretty good job. They were pretty happy. I couldn't get paid because I was working for another company at the time. I was moonlighting. So they asked me how I would like to get paid. And I said, I'd like to have an introduction and a lunch with Paul White. So I think that was around about 1998 or 1999. And that was where I really connected with Paul. And between 1999 and into 2005, I got to know Paul quite well. And after a number of years, I kind of realized I better get Paul's story straight. And he agreed to work with me to come up with this Origins of Beatlemania book. So Paul was generous with his time on the Red Book, and he was also generous with his time on this new book, the Blue Book. So the Red Book, I think I started working on it pretty much full time in 2009 when I retired from my previous career. Mm-hmm. And that involved interviewing people that Paul thought I should interview, including people like Ronnie Hawkins and Richie York and other people, of course, that worked for Capitol Records. And Paul gave me full access to his archive of papers and photographs. And of course, with the internet, you've got all kinds of access to information. But of course, Bruce Spicer was a key contact for me, and Mark Lewison was a key contact for me. I didn't want to make it a discography book as such. I wanted to get into the history. So I went back to, the roots of rock and roll in Canada, which came to Canada via the airwaves across the border from your great country. And, the United States gave rock and roll to the world. And Canada was a willing recipient. We had people like Buddy Holly and the Everly Brothers, Little Richard, all of these great artists that would come into Canada, usually on their tours across the northern U.S. They would take side trips up to places like Winnipeg or Calgary or Vancouver, Toronto. Elvis played Toronto and Ottawa. He was banned pretty much from playing in Montreal by the Roman Catholic Church. He was deemed to be very radical in his early days for them. So I wanted to tell that story. And then, of course, the story of how the relationship of Canada as a part of the British Commonwealth and the flow of people between Canada and the UK. Usually it was people leaving the UK to come to Canada. Paul White was a good example. He didn't like what was happening. He didn't see a future for himself in England after the war. He did his military service in the UK and then finished with that. He worked for a couple of newspapers, then decided he saw a film about Canada. He said, that's where I want to go. And he came to Canada, started literally at the bottom of the ladder with Capitol Records in Toronto. He ran out of money very quickly. He saw an ad for a job in the Capitol warehouse. He saw the logo in the ad, stuck out for him because when he was a teenager, he'd bought a copy of a Capitol 78 by Mel Torme called Blue Moon. So that good old Mel Torme was responsible for getting Paul into Capitol Records. So Paul started there in 57, I believe. By 1961, he was sort of filling in for no one because nobody was doing A&R. They were just taking every release from LA and putting it out in Canada pretty much. So he spotted an opportunity because EMI had bought Capitol in the States in more or less of a hands-off situation. Paul saw that there was a lot of top 30 material in the UK that would be suitable for Canada, not suitable for the USA. So he started releasing records by groups like Cliff Richard, artists like Helen, off the beaten path groups like the Temperance Seven or John Layton, or even a record by George Martin under the name of Ray Cathode. These were getting released on 7-inch singles in Canada and finding a little bit of a market. So the answer to, I guess, the question why the Beatles got signed in Canada first, I can't speak for Dave Dexter. Paul White told me that Dave Dexter was a jazz guy and an older jazz guy and didn't necessarily like the sound of the harmonica in popular records. So take that as you may. I don't know if Dave Dexter was wrong anyway. If he'd released Love Me Do on Capitol, would it have sold anyway? Who knows? It didn't sell in Canada. It sold like 200 copies. So I don't think Love Me Do was ever going to make number one in North America in early 1963. But Paul White decided to release Love Me Do in February, release Please Please Me in April, and then From Me to You in June. He got some traction with those records. It kept going up. He kept liking them. He saw what was happening in the UK. He was reading Melody Maker, New Musical Express, all of the magazines that we got here at our W.H. Smith shops. And he paid attention to what was happening in the UK because he thought he could do well with these records here. So I think he was onto something. Sales were going up, and he created a Capitol 6,000 album series and a 72,000 single series. And the Beatles would have their first 3 albums in Canada on the 6,000 series, and all of their first 9 singles on the 72,000 series. So by the end of '63, he hit pay dirt with She Loves You. It went to #1 on some charts in Canada. And he released the first album, which was the second British album with the Beatles. He called it Beatlemania with the Beatles. He threw on some tabloid text on the cover, and it took off like a rocket. So at Christmas time in '63, RCA was peddling Fun in Acapulco by Elvis Presley, and Capitol was pushing Beatlemania with the Beatles. And people didn't know it, but both of those albums were being pressed by the same company, because RCA Victor in Smith Falls, Ontario, was pressing records under contract for Capitol Records. So, as I recall, I believe 50,000 copies of Beatlemania with the Beatles were sold before Christmas, which was a really good sign that the Beatles were taking off in Canada.
Going back to what you were saying, I mean, there's so much information from Paul White in the book, and you have a spectacular attention to detail. And I know it has to do with a lot of what Paul has to say in there, and with Bruce and Mark Lewis, and there's just so much information in the book. Why do you think Capitol did not, in America, didn't pick up the same thing? They let Canada do Beatlemania. That would have seemed to have been a really good idea. Really something that really could have hooked the market pretty quickly. And they
Well,
didn't do
I
that.
think through the conversations with Paul White was working with Capitol Records in the States, but he had more interaction with the people on the eastern side of the States. So he was working with, I think, the New York Capitol people.
Hmm.
I don't know if you remember any of those people, but they were certainly pushing to get Beatles records released in the States, but they were facing an uphill battle. The person in New York that worked with Paul was basically doing all the PR work in tandem with Paul White. So where Capitol had these, if you look in the Blue Book, they had these artist sort of biographies. I found evidence that basically Paul was working with his partners in New York, and the biographies were being prepared in December. So when the Beatles were signed to Capitol in the States, all this material was all ready to go. So they didn't ignore Canada. I think it was a case that Capitol on the eastern side of the States was very aware of what was happening in Canada and was using the material or sharing the material that EMI had sent to Toronto.
Hmm. What was the difference between the radio markets in America and in Canada? Were they about the same, or were there differences? In other words, when the records got released and they got sent to the stations, did Canadian radio respond in the same way that America did, you think?
Well, no, because two things about Canada. Number one, the big radio networks in the States after World War II were investing a lot of money in transmitter power. So
Hmm.
you had stations in Buffalo, WKBW. You had a station in Chicago, WLS, I believe. And
Hmm.
you had the big ones in New York City and I believe Boston. And of course, they were pumping out amplitude modulated waves. And because we were up in the north, the gravitational impact of the moon was flattening those waves out of the States, and they would go longer. So as a kid, and I shared a bedroom with an older brother, in 1963, we'd turn our transistor on and we could get those stations from the States loud and clear. So a lot of teenagers were actually listening to radio in the States, so they could pick up on some of the new records that were being played on these big stations in the States. It certainly didn't go the other way. Nobody in the United States was listening to Canadian radio stations. So Capitol did their best. They would mail out to about 200 different stations on their mailing list. They would mail out promotional copies of any new release, whether it was by Peggy Lee or Nat King Cole or the Beatles. They would all get sent a copy. So Paul White developed this thing called a sizzle sheet. He'd publish it every Friday, and he would send out the sizzle sheet to these 200 stations. It was a 2-page thing that listed all their new releases that week, and he would also send them the records. So he didn't send them every record, but he would send them the ones he thought would be good in their market. So we're a huge country like the United States with 1/10 of the population. So a lot of small radio stations were getting records. So the Beatles were charting on smaller stations, like in the upper Ottawa Valley, north of Ottawa, in Ontario, in Winnipeg, and London, Ontario. There were pockets of interest in the Beatles. And so, for example, in June of 63, Winnipeg was putting the Beatles From Me to You against Del Shannon's version of From Me to You. And in most cases, people knew the name Del Shannon. They didn't know the name the Beatles. So in most cases, fans would call the station and say, we want to hear the Del Shannon version. But you remember, Steve, that the record companies and the radio stations were joined at the hip. The record company would mail those records to the radio station. If the radio station played them and the teenager at home listened to the radio station and they liked what they were hearing, they would then phone the radio station and say, who was that? And can you play it again? And if they got a lot of feedback, if the radio station got a lot of feedback, that was always counted in terms of the charts that they would do every week. It was based on record sales. It was based on radio station requests. And a third thing they included was jukebox plays. So there was a bit of a circle there. So if the record company sent the record, the radio station played the record, the radio listeners liked the record, they liked it enough to go and buy it so that they could play it anytime they wanted in their bedroom or in their rec room. That was the circle that record companies were, that's where they made their money. So I think to answer your question about radio station play, yeah, radio stations in Canada could play those records that Paul White and Capitol Records sent them, but they could also hear new records from the States. Of course, they were played via the local Canadian stations, or if they tuned in late in the evening to some of these powerful American radio stations.
But Canada didn't just copy the singles that America released. They did many of their own. You mentioned Love Me Do. I mean, there were other examples too. I believe From Me to You was another one that got released.
Yep. So Love Me Do charted in Montreal at the end of February 63. Please Please Me charted in Alberta, and it charted in Ontario on select radio stations charts. And then From Me to You was charted in a lot of places. And of course, by the time She Loves You came around in September of 63, the charts, really, it took a while, but it took about 3 months for She Loves You to hit number one. So it wasn't like an instant favorite like it was in the UK where they had advance orders. But Paul White said it was the record that broke the Beatles in Canada.
You mentioned in the book that the Beatles had a significant influence on Neil Young as a young performer, and that he and his musical partner Ken Copeland were covering Beatles songs. Did any of them come out? Did any of them get released?
No. Ken Copeland, who was in the band The Squires with Neil Young, kept meticulous records of their set lists wherever they played. And the book that I reference is called Young Neil, about Neil Young's younger years. In the back of that book are all of the set lists that Ken had compiled back in the 1963 into 64 period. So they were playing these small high school dances, but they were incorporating Beatles songs and songs from the album Beatlemania. So a song like All My Loving is the song they would be playing even before kids heard it on the Ed Sullivan Show, which we got here in Canada, which I saw in February of 64. So the Ed Sullivan wasn't just a phenomenon in the States, it was a phenomenon here in Canada too. So that was really the first time fans could actually see them live. And I think that was what blew people away. It was that, wow, these guys can play The records are good, but they can play too.
Were there any other American TV shows that got picked up there, like Shindig and Hullabaloo? Did those get picked up in Canada?
Later, CBC had their own kind of teen shows that focused on Canadian artists. I think one was called Music Hop. Later on, they had some good shows, but we did get something called Cablevision in sort of the 1965 period. So if you live near the border, you could subscribe to Cablevision and you could get those shows like Shindig and Hullabaloo. But
Mhm.
I had to go to my neighbor's house to watch those because they had Cablevision. My parents didn't pay for Cablevision. And Canada didn't get color television until 1966, late 1966. So we lagged the United States on that television technology.
Last time we talked, we discussed the Beatles Toronto 65 soundboard, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you said that Apple is aware of it and Apple has looked at it, but Apple is not doing anything with it or wasn't doing anything with it when we talked last. I'm just wondering if anything has happened with that since. Is there any more interest in that?
I think there was a lot of interest. The big revelation was in August, September of 2024, when I was at the Chicago Fest. And that was when we were listening to a Zoom call with Michael Lindsay Hogg and Peter Jackson. And Peter Jackson mentioned that he had acquired the Star Club tapes and that his artificial AI or whatever his software was would work pretty much only with the original tapes. Like it would not work well with a copy of the original tape. So I went back to Toronto. John Brower was somebody who I'd been friendly with for many, many years. He said, "Look, why don't you take those tapes into a studio and see if they're still any good?" I'd taken them over to Abbey Road in 2015, but they'd only played them on a quarter-inch Sony, a run-of-the-mill Sony tape deck. So it sounded okay, but it didn't sound brilliant. But on this occasion in Toronto, the engineer had access to a half-track player, and we'd listened to the quarter-track playback. It sounded good. And then our jaws dropped when we heard it on the half-track because we'd missed so much stuff. You hear the Beatles talking on stage. You hear Ringo's drumming. Of course, there was a 6-channel mixer, an Altec mixer, and everything was mixed into mono, of course. But you have the ability in 2026, here we are, to isolate these things. So what I decided, there was huge interest. We had a Billboard article, we had a Financial Times article, and a Toronto Star article about it. Lots of interest, and we did have some conversations via email with Peter Jackson's people. And I did go to London, and I think what happened was it was earlier in 2025. I had arranged to go to Apple, but my schedule didn't work. They had a snowstorm, so my whole schedule got changed. I didn't actually go into Apple, but I did update them on the fact that it was now discovered to be a half track. So I did send them a few clips. I left it at that. And then, as you were mentioning, that they were busy working on their anthology project. And I always know from Apple that everything is in their universe, but it's not always on the front burner. So they have expressed interest in the tapes. I agreed to just leave it where it was and note that I wanted to get the book out in 2025. And the book, of course, references the tapes. So I wanted to make sure that story's out in the book, and then we can pick it up in 2026. So the answer, short answer, long answer, is that I haven't done anything with the tapes yet, but I see a good future for those tapes. The quality is very good. The beauty of it is that it's the whole concert. So you have 39 songs. You've got 27 opening songs, albeit some are short. And then you've got 12 by the Beatles, the full set, and good quality. And then you've got the entire extended press conference. So everything was recorded professionally in the way that directly compares to the equipment that they were using at the Hollywood Bowl, Ampex Half Track, and at the Shea Stadium Ampex Half Track. So I think that's encouraging. People should maybe hope that Apple will do something. And obviously, I can't do anything with these tapes without their permission. So I
Right.
think that's you're in a situation where you want to share this with the world, but it has to be done at the right time.
You have a clip of the of Sounds Incorporated from the Toronto 65 tape on the CD that comes with the book. I'm guessing that that's not at the half speed. That's the regular version because
Yeah,
it sounds kind
that
of
that
it
was
sounds
that
kind of
was
rough.
yeah, that was done in 2017. So yeah, it wasn't updated. I didn't update. I updated some of the graphics on that booklet with the new book, just to put 2025 and correct some of the text, but I did not change any of the audio. So no, the answer is that's not the best audio of that Sounds Incorporated. But
But I will.
I
But
did.
I mean, it's very clear. I mean, it's quite clear considering the age of the tape.
Well,
So
I
I can
think
only
people
imagine what.
will be.
Go ahead.
I from what I've read about Shea Stadium, and I can't remember which book it was. It talks about the overdubs that the Beatles did to get the
Hmm.
Shea Stadium television audio, synced with the film for television. My sense is that the Toronto recordings were actually, because it wasn't done out on a baseball field on whatever it was equipment that they had. Maybe they felt that the technical side of it at Shea Stadium wasn't good enough. That's why they did the overdubs. That's why they went and used some of the Hollywood Bowl stuff. But in the case of Toronto, it's exactly what you hear. I'm guessing that who knows what happened to those Shea Stadium tapes, but
Yeah.
the Toronto tapes are in. They the engineer tells me that these tapes, from the mid '60s, were made using whale oil, and that is what keeps them long lasting, as
Hmm.
opposed to tapes from the '70s that don't. They have to be baked. Well, these tapes don't have to be baked.
There's also a Toronto 66 Beatles soundboard. Is that true?
Yeah, I owned the Toronto '66 tapes, but they were done from the audience. So it's a different animal altogether. But I've since donated that tape, the original tape and the tape recorder it was made from, to the University of Toronto. You can go there anytime and listen to it. You can hear Paperback Writer and If I Needed Someone, but I'm telling you, it's been bootlegged as well. So it's not great quality, but it's a record of their performance. There's that to it.
Was there a difference in reaction to the Beatles Butcher cover? Was there
Yeah.
a difference in reaction in Canada to that as opposed to America?
Yeah, it's interesting. I did a whole chapter in the Blue Book on the Butcher cover.
Right.
Um, when the Butcher hit the fan, so to speak, in the States, uh, everybody in Capital, there was memos written. You can see all these memos going all over the United States. They forgot to let Canada know that the record was being recalled in the States. I guess Canada was always an afterthought. So I'd say there was a when people were told in a certain week, it's in the book, about the recall in the States, it wasn't until the following week that Capitol was informed that the record cover was no longer suitable. So there were, I think Paul White told me there were 80,000 Butcher mono covers produced, shrink wrapped, and shipped from the Compo factory in Cornwall to the
Hmm.
Toronto warehouse. And it was a case where these 80,000 albums, obviously boxed up and in the warehouse, had to be then sent back to the Compo factory where the records had to be removed from their covers. And back then they would have had another cover ready to go. So I did interview one of the employees who thought it was weird that he come in for an afternoon shift, which was like 4 p.m. to midnight, where all they did was take out the records, put the records in a pile, put the covers in another pile, and then the record covers were incinerated. So that's in the book. So a gallon of gas and a book of matches seemed to finish off the Canadian butchers. However, like Paul White said, it's on the recording on that audio CD, the butcher was kaput, but one lucky truck driver, I interviewed his son in the book, The truck driver was a man of probably in his mid to late 30s with two young children at home. He was the guy that was there to drop off these records or pick them up. I'm not sure which. And for all the good work that he did, somebody handed him on the loading dock a shrink wrap copy of this Butcher mono album. And of course, he wasn't a Beatles fan. He took it home, filed it in his record cabinet, and left it there. So it was many, many years later when his son approached me and said he thought he had a Canadian Butcher. And I asked him to bring it to me, and he did. And that's the only Butcher that I'm aware of that escaped the match and the gasoline.
Nice. Do you have it, or does he still have it?
He still has it. Yeah. And I think he's going to probably find out there's more interest in it now that the book's been published. But Bruce Spicer, he acquired Paul White's mono sample jacket and his stereo slick. And Bruce has generously included in his little booklet that comes with the Blue Book a beautiful color photo of Paul's stereo slick. One of a kind.
Unbelievable. On another controversy, the Lennon Jesus comment, we know how that went over here, especially in the South. But Canadians seem to take it more leisurely. It didn't bother them as much. They got it where Americans didn't all get it. Is that, am I right there?
You had a magazine in the US called Datebook, and I think it was that Datebook article that triggered a whole load of controversy. But the Maureen Cleave interview with John Lennon, where he talked about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus Christ, appeared in the Canadian press whenever Maureen did the original article. And it just, as you say, it just passed by. People read it. John Lennon. However, when the Beatles came to play Toronto in 66, the controversy followed them from the States. So there were a lot of American journalists that were just on the tour, and they'd go with every one of these press conferences, including the one in Toronto. And there were many questions about John's comments. Well, there were a few radio stations in Canada, and I would say they were more of the rural kind. So you had in the Upper Ottawa Valley a radio station called CHOV, which OV was for Ottawa Valley. They banned Beatle records for a year. So, for example, you would not hear Yellow Submarine or Eleanor Rigby played on that radio station. You would not hear Penny Lane or Strawberry Fields played on that radio station. They probably came back with All You Need Is Love, but that was one example. A radio station in Quebec City banned the Beatles. A radio station in Edmonton, Alberta banned the Beatles. These were not the big metropolitan centers. So I would agree with what you're saying. By and large, Canadians were shocked, but not totally surprised. My recollection, I can't remember if I put it in the book, but I was a student, and I remember the day. I think it was around August or September, must have been around about that time of 66. And I was at the IGA, which is like your Safeway or your grocery store, A&P, whatever. And they were talking about this controversy. And my family was a regular church-going kind of family. I hated going at the age I was at, but I was forced to go. And I found it was quite, and I was a John Lennon fan. And I thought, well, this is quite horrific that he would say something like that. That how dare he, But I didn't stop being a Beatles fan.
Another thing I noticed was there were more hostile reactions to the Monkees in Canada than there were here. You printed one in particular where the guy
said they were created by an IBM computer.
We didn't get that down here. And I was kind of surprised. And I kept thinking of the fact that, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has not inducted the Monkees when I really think they should be in there. And
the Monkees proved themselves to be an incredible group. I think the facts are this. The Beatles had nothing new for Christmas 66. No new 45, no new album. In the door came the Monkees. And a Beatles fan like myself, maybe like yourself, we were irked that somebody would dare to copy the Beatles and have these records, Here We Come, the Monkees, and all these early Monkees hits. They were good songs and they had great songwriters, but they weren't writing those songs. And we were told they weren't playing the instruments. So we were kind of like shocked. But yet the girls in my class loved the Monkees. They dropped the Beatles and went for the Monkees. And that was really tough on us young male Beatles fans.
I agree with you that they absolutely may not have started out, real strong, but they got stronger as time went on. How did you see that the Canadians reacted to Yoko?
Yoko has an interesting link to Canada. She was friendly with a CBC cameraman named Phil Pendry, and the stories are in the book. She and her husband, Tony Cox, had this idea for a film called Bottoms, which was filming all these people, male and female, with naked bottoms. Allegedly, people like Michael Caine and other people had their bum filmed for this Bottoms film. And Phil Pendry had known Yoko since he was a cameraman in Tokyo in the early 60s. And I think Yoko, it's in the book, but I think Yoko took over his apartment when he moved to London. And when Yoko ended up in London, they renewed their friendship. And Yoko used the services of cameraman Phil and perhaps some of CBC's film and some of CBC's equipment to make that Bottoms film. And you'll find out in the book that CBC prepared some great filmed interviews for release in Canada for these news magazine type of programs. So Yoko Ono debuted on Canadian CBC television in 1967, probably after she'd met John, but before they were sort of publicly together. And it's interesting to watch that film now. Yoko was an experimental artist, and I think through the Blue Book, as you'll find, she comes to Canada 3 times in 1969. She comes with John for the Bed-In. She's singing her stuff at the Rock and Roll Revival. And of course, they have a peace program, peace campaign, and their target was to meet the Canadian Prime Minister and to get his views on their anti-war campaign and perhaps get him on side. So Yoko has quite a connection with Canada in 1969. The White Album, I think I make a note in there that their Revolution Number 9 was somewhat inspired, if not very much inspired, by an album done by a Canadian media guru named Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan had put out an album on Columbia Records in late 67, early 68, I'm not sure when, but it sounds an awful lot like Revolution Number 9, about a year and a half before that shows up on the White Album. I think John and Yoko were very aware of what was happening in the world, not just in the UK, but in other places too. So they were soaking up a lot of influences. Yoko was clearly in touch with CBC. The Bottoms film became a very important film for film students, didn't it? It's something that gets shown to film students around the world.
John and Yoko became very close to Ronnie Hawkins. They also knew Richie York, and they obviously knew John Brower because John Brower co-promoted the Rock and Roll Revival show that they appeared at. So there's a lot of connections between the Beatles and Canada with John and Yoko. Did the other Beatles have as much connection with Canada as John and Yoko did?
No. And I think when the Beatles stopped touring in 66, of course, they stopped coming to North America and they stopped having press conferences. So after 66, if they're going to interview the Beatles, they have to go to London. So you start getting CBC going to London in 68. They do some video interviews with George Harrison at Apple. Chum FM, the underground station, again, it's in the book. They go over to Savile Row in 68 in around about October, and they do audio interviews with Paul McCartney and I think George.
Okay.
Or maybe John. Anyway, those people connected with the Beatles. The one that really did the job was Kim Fowley. Kim Fowley was brought in by John Brower to be the MC for the Rock and Roll Revival. When
Right.
tickets weren't selling, Fowley had the idea, and he had John Lennon's phone number at Apple, and he told John Brower, look, you got to get John Lennon over here to boost ticket sales because you're going to lose a fortune. What really happened is that not only did John Brower and his colleague Hugh Curry, who was this, not only was he the chum guy that went over to interview the Beatles at Savile Row, he was also later on with CBC went over there to interview the Beatles while they were making the Get Back film. So it was, in fact, Richie York who was introduced to George Harrison by Derek Taylor. So an interview had been arranged such that Richie York would go to London and interview George Harrison about the new Abbey Road album before it was being released in Canada. So the Globe and Mail would get this story with George Harrison, track by track, Abbey Road. It was a great interview. It's a great story. The funny thing was, Richie arrives in London. He'd worked there before. He came originally from Australia via London to Canada. He goes into, basically knocks on the door of Apple 3 days before, 4 days before. He just wants to know where the office is. So he goes over to Apple on the Thursday before the rock and roll revival. And he just happens to be in the lobby looking around when this call comes in from Hugh Curry and John Brower, this Hail Mary call via Kim Fowley, asked John Lennon if he would come to play at the rock and roll revival on the Saturday. So this is the Thursday. And John's interested because of the lineup, Gene Vincent, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, et cetera, et cetera. So John's excited. And it was Richie York that just happened to be there who vouched for what John Brower was pitching with Hugh Curry. So I don't think it would have come across so well without Richie York being there. So Richie York didn't actually go to the rock and roll revival because he was in London and he had that interview with George Harrison on the Monday following the rock and roll revival. So Richie being in London and John calling from Toronto with Hugh Curry, some of that recording is on the audio disc. It just was unbelievable. And Brower said, "You mean would you come to be an MC?" He said, "No, I'd want to come and play." And of course, Brower assumed the Beatles were going to come to play, but that was never going to happen. But it is what it is, and that's how it ended up.
I talked to Brower, and he tells all that story, and it's in the movie, and I can't. The name of the movie escapes me. What is it?
Revival '69. Revival. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great movie. If you have not seen it, I highly recommend it. It was amazing to watch, not only to see the concert itself, but all the actual phone calls that Richie York made are in that movie, and it's wonderful. It really is. Another thing you have in the book is the story of the OPP patch on the Sergeant Pepper uniform, and there seem to be a couple of different theories as to where that patch came from.
Yeah, if you go back to the Red Book from 2015, 2016, there is a story there from an OPP officer who allegedly gave 4 badges to the Beatles in September of '64. But then, when I get into the Blue Book, there's an actual photograph of George Harrison with 2 OPP officers. And of course, they've just come from Shea Stadium where they were given Wells Fargo badges by the Wells Fargo people. And it seemed like they were on some kind of a badge thing in '65. So my guess from what the stories I got across the years, and I got several, was the following. The OPP badges may have been given to all 4 Beatles. I don't know 100%. But the only photo evidence is George with 2 OPP officers looking at a badge. So my theory, based on everything I've heard and people I've talked to, and knowing that when he was asked on that Google thing a few years ago, Paul really didn't know how he came to get that badge. He called it an op thingy. My theory is that the badges were brought to, or one badge was brought to that Sergeant Pepper photo session. and one was sewn on to one of the Pepper outfits, the blue one.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm guessing that that blue one might have been for George, and at some point somebody said Paul looks better in blue, or Paul said I look better in blue, and George ended up with the orange one without the badge. That's the way I think it might have happened, but we'll never know.
We'll never know.
Unless somebody comes up with a film or something like that. I don't know. But that's the answer I got.
You also mentioned that CDC Action Set Sergeant Pepper special. I'm just curious, can that be seen anywhere online? Is that available, or
It's a radio special. It wasn't a film. It
can
was
that
a
be
radio
heard?
special.
Can that be heard somewhere online?
Yeah, yeah. I rescued that from a dumpster when CBC was pitching all their 10-inch tapes back in whenever the early 90s, mid 90s. And there was that one. And there's also one that CBC kept in their library from May 67 called How the Beatles Changed the World. So you had How the Beatles Changed the World in May 67, which was a special about the Beatles' impact on music and fashion and religion. And that included one of the earliest interviews with the Pink Floyd, the Fugs, Richard Goldstein. I think you probably know. I interviewed Richard from New York. They went to all kinds of different people. And then again in August, they had an extended interview with George Martin from London that was done by a CBC freelancer in London and then sent to Toronto. So that the Sgt. Pepper special included what I thought was brilliant stuff from two people from the Jefferson Airplane who happened to be in Toronto for a week doing a series at the O'Keefe Center, which, by the way, was going to be, well, that's another story. It was going to be emceed by Brian Epstein. It's in the book. Brian Epstein signed on with the CBC to do the series, and he booked his tickets to come to Toronto to be the MC. Sadly, he passed away. They replaced him with Noel Harrison from, The Girl from U.N.C.L.E., son of Rex Harrison. Anyway.
That was just before, that was days before, his death was days before he was supposed to tape that, correct?
Correct. Yeah, he'd already booked his tickets. Yeah.
It was
sad.
Very, very sad. Where can people find the CBC special?
Probably from CBC, because I gave it back to them. I returned back to their archive.
How can people get the books now? That's the big question. Let's start with the blue one first. The blue one
can be purchased at the website thebeatlesincanada.com. And we've shipped a bunch of books to the States. We began doing that December the 1st, and I'm still shipping books to the States. These books are history books, and they're exempt from tariffs. So any idea that these books are going to be tariffed or duty shouldn't apply at all, because we're exempt for that. The books are available in two formats. The author's signature edition, which is the same hardcover book. It's got a poster, it's got a CD with a booklet, and it's got a bookmark. And those are at $150. And then the signature plated edition books have a plate signed by Sandy Gardner, who is the first pop journalist in North America to review a Beatle record. He reviewed Love Me Do for the Ottawa Journal in March of '63. He also attended all of the Beatles concerts in Canada and interviewed John and Yoko at the Bed-In. Sandy was a brilliant pop journalist. He lives in Florida now. And he interviewed George Martin at Air Studios in '65 at the time they were doing Yesterday for Paul McCartney. Very plugged into what was happening in England and a huge influence on Canadian Beatles fans for sure. So that's where you can get the books. You wanted to ask about the other book.
The other book is or is not available now. It is not, correct? The red book?
It's not currently available other than as an ebook from Apple Books. So if you go on to Apple Books, I think it's about $25. You get the whole book. The beauty of the ebook is that it includes the audio, and it includes more audio than what was on the audio disc. And it's also, I recommend it for anybody who has the original printed book, because you can search it. We don't have room to put an index in for these books because they're so big. The red book, when it was published, was 476 pages. The blue book is a hefty 640 pages. The Blue Book is printed in full color,
Yes.
whereas the Red Book was a black and white book with a color section in the middle. The riddle I had to deal with was how to keep the Blue Book price competitive for fans. And believe it or not, the price of the hardcover Blue Book is the same as the 2016 price of the hardcover Red Book. So we did our best, you know. Things are not cheap. We know that. It's expensive to put these books together, but I believe we've gone as price competitive as you're going to get for a limited edition, signed, numbered book with all of this information.
But you are planning to reissue the Red Book in hardcover, correct?
We are planning a version 2 of the Red Book in 2026 that will be printed in color. So watch for that. That'll be available on the same website, thebeatlesincanada.com. Omnibus Books in the UK. If you're listening to this podcast from the UK, Omnibus Books, they've been sent. In fact, they arrived in the UK today at their warehouse. They are selling the signature edition. They're taking advance orders for that, and it will be available through their network. I know they cover some really good bookshops like Foyle's Books and Waterstones and places like that. But if you want to order it in advance, you can do from the Omnibus. I think it's called omnibuspress.co.uk. I'm not exactly sure, but do a search on that. You'll find it. The books are heavy. They're over 6 pounds a piece.
Yes, they are.
And
are we still talking about the Blue Book or the Red Book? The Blue Book is very heavy.
The Blue Book is 6 pounds. The Red Book is probably 4 pounds. But I had to ship these on a ship. A ship has containers, and you got to put the books on a pallet in a container. And you have to pray like heck that the ship gets across without hitting an iceberg. And then these books make it to the store. I was really happy that I've worked again with the same printing company that I'd worked with in 2016. The pandemic came along. They had the good sense to upgrade their printing presses to color. And I believe they've done a really good job on the images in the book. I wish some of the images could be larger, but I think we've done a pretty good job of layout, imagery, and making sure that you've got all the information in there. There's some good stories in there about John and Yoko that people may not be familiar with. There's a great story of them having a flat tire on their way to the immigration hearing that they were going to have so they could stay in Canada for the bed-in. Yoko arriving without her immunization record at the Rock and Roll Revival. And so there's things like that. I like that kind of detail. I like being able to track down the gas station where they stopped when they were driving from Montreal to Ottawa for the peace conference. John allegedly had an upset stomach. I'm not sure that was the case, or he just wanted to go to the bathroom, but they did stop on a highway that's no longer used. It's no longer the main road between Montreal and Ottawa. So I spent about a week trying to find that gas station, and lo and behold, I found it, and the pictures are in the book.
The graphics in the book are absolutely amazing. When I was going through it, I was just astounded. And like I said earlier, the detail in the book is incredible. Anybody that's familiar with Bruce Spizer's books knows his attention to detail, and that is the same thing that Pierce does with his.
I've got a shout out to Bruce Spicer. I learned a lot from Bruce. I was one of his early fans, and I still am. His books are beautiful to read and beautiful to look at.
They are. I know we just had the news that the fest is not going to hold live events in 2026. Are you going to be doing any personal appearances anywhere that you know of right now? Do you know what your plans are for people listening to this?
I haven't lined up anything for 2026. I literally ran a marathon to get the book out. I'm spending part of my day going to the post office and getting packages organized and out. I want to make sure the early birds get all their books. And I'm working with Mark Lapidos to organize books available from his website. So stay tuned for that. As far as personal appearances, I know that was tough to hear that we're not going to be able to go to the New York, New Jersey Fest in March or Chicago in August, but I do understand that they're redesigning the fest. I'm open
There are
to anything.
there are Beatle conventions. There's Florida.
I know there was one recently, a Rubber Soul thing that Ken Womack organized, and I wanted desperately to go to that, but I was too busy with this project. But I'm almost going to bet, you asked me at the beginning what I'm looking into the future, and I'm looking at my crystal ball, and I'm guessing there's going to be a some kind of revolver symposium in 2026 or a butcher cover symposium. And I would love to go to either of those. So I'll let you
which
know.
which reminds me, I should ask you, since I got such a good answer from you with the anthology the last time we talked, is there anything in the wind that you're hearing?
Well, all I've heard is that there is demand for a Rubber Soul box
Right,
set. Whether that comes out, we've already had a revolver one, so they don't
right.
need to do that. So if I was going to pin the tail on the donkey, I'd say Rubber Soul box set. So what if it's a year late? We'd love to see it. I think Rubber Soul is a masterpiece, just like other Beatles masterpieces, but it deserves a box set. I think you would agree.
Yeah, I do. I'd like to see them hit all of the rest of them, but I have a feeling that I'm not going to be around to see that, unfortunately. But
You
hopefully,
never know.
yeah, you never know. Hopefully, the younger Beatle fans will do. Somebody put out the word that they were thinking of combining the box sets so they could get more of them in.
Jeff Jones retired, and we have a new head of Apple. And whether they go down the road of physical product or more the Disney Plus road, the Disney Plus road is a good road. I like it. There's so much video of the Beatles and so much opportunity to do it in high quality video, high quality audio. There's got to be much more that can come out that way. But I still haven't even had time to listen to Anthology 4. I'm so snowed under, pardon the pun, but I've just been working on this Blue Book. So my goal was that, Steve, to have it out by the time I was 70. So that was, didn't quite get that. I'm a little bit behind, but I wanted to have it out in 2025, and that was my goal, and I did it. So I share your comment. Are we going to be around long enough to see some of this stuff? There are certain other people that are still late on delivering projects. I know how much work goes into this. I've just spent the last decade on this thing. And to get it where you want it to be takes a lot of sweat equity. And eventually you have to say, it's done. They say you never finish a book, you walk away from it. And I walked away from this in 2025. And I feel quite happy with the result. And I hope readers will agree with that.
I think they will. In fact, I know they will because I've seen the book, I have the book, and it's absolutely amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Piers Hemmingsen, what can I say? Thank you again for taking the time. This has been a wonderful conversation. I really enjoy talking to you, and I hope we get to do this maybe for the next box set or thing that happens. I hope we get to do this again. So,
Well, I would love to see the Beatles 65 Toronto concert out there. Hello, Apple, if you're listening. And and
yes, Apple, hello.
and I think they could do a terrific job with it. We discovered something in 2024 that was truly amazing, and we didn't know anything about it, and now we do. So thank you, Steve, for your time today. And I wish everybody a happy new year. And hopefully we'll get to some in-person things in the States in 2026.
Okay. All right. I'm going to shut the button off. Here we go. Okay, folks, here's the clip of the Beatles Toronto 65 soundboard that Piers Hemmingsen allowed us to use. We thank Piers Hemmingsen for allowing us to use it. It's a non-musical segment, but it'll give you an idea of what the sound quality of the Beatles 65 soundboard will sound like if we ever get it. Here are some technical details about the tape. as provided by Piers Hemmingsen. The tape was recorded at Maple Leaf Gardens on August 17th, 1965, at the afternoon show, which was the first show after Shea Stadium. Opening remarks feature the voice of Chum 1050 AM MC Jungle J. Nelson. The original recording is courtesy of Piers Hemmingsen, for which we thank him. Half-track tape transfer to 48K digital was completed by Doug McClement at Livewire Studios in Toronto. Again, thanks to Piers Hemmingsen, and here we go.
All right, hold it down. The telegrams after 4 section in CHUM are proud to bring back to Toronto the Beatles!
Hello.
Thanks very much for listening to our podcast today. If you enjoyed our program, we'd really appreciate a positive review at the place where you get your podcasts. Apple and Google love positive reviews, and it really helps us. If you don't already, please subscribe to our show so you'll get our newest shows right away. We have some great shows coming up. We would love to hear your suggestions for the show, so please write to us at BeatlesNewsBriefs@gmail.com or catch us online on Facebook in our Beatles News and Information group. If you've missed any of our past shows, you can hear them at marinucci.podbean.com, and please tell your friends about us. We appreciate you all for listening. Now here again is Steve Marinucci.
Well, that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the interview with Piers Hemmingsen. We really did. If you haven't already, please subscribe and leave us a great review. It would really help get the podcast seen by more people. Again, we thank you for being there and listening and watching, and we hope you're enjoying this, because we really are. Until next time, this is Steve Marinucci saying thanks again, and we'll be seeing you.
What a show! Oh, wonderful.